device that might distract you from a human being that's standing, or sitting rather, right in front of you, please abandon that device and be reassured that the device will still exist when class is dismissed. I will not take your devices away from you. We have not yet moved to a socialist society. Okay? All right. So what I want to do as we wrap up this last hour or so is to begin hopefully what will be a robust but productive discussion about masculinity and the role that masculinity should or should not play in the act of social transformation, if indeed social transformation is desirable. And I hope that the semester has allowed you an opportunity to ask questions about what is masculinity. Latino masculinities, African American masculinities, but I'm hopeful that we will also ask questions about Euro-American masculinities as well, and begin to think about how they articulate themselves and what role they play in the larger society. I think that you guys, by and large, have been pretty open book. I mean, if this is the book, I would say maybe we're not like this, but we're like this, you know? We cracked it a bit, you know? And I think the reading journals definitely helped you a lot to reflect and whatnot. So I wanted to do, first of all, is to think about power. And I want to think about the ways in which, our levels fine? Am I too close to this mic?
No, sir, you're fine.
Okay, great. So hopefully you can pick everybody else up. So we might have to speak up a little bit for the end. So if you feel like you're shouting, you're okay. But I want to think about Huey Newton. Does anyone remember how the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, who founded the party, how long ago was the Black Panther Party founded in Oakland, California?
1966.
So how long ago was that?
Lots of years.
50 lots of years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exactly 50 years ago. How did he define power? Natalia.
Power is the ability to.
Okay. She's waiting for it. Guys, watch out.
Power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner.
Okay. Yeah, that was quick. That's precisely the way that Huey Newton defined power. And I regarded that as theorizing, that this is political theory. It's political theory in a way that might relate to, as Huey Newton would also say to the brother on the block. Does anyone remember the ways in which you guys, the conversation, I don't know if it was so much of a debate, but the conversation that we had about power before I provided you with that definition? Do you remember what you all said collectively and where you were in agreement and where you differed? I'd like to talk about that a little bit before I actually show you a clip of a Detroit activist, a Detroit Black Power activist, and then I want to give you the question that our final question of the semester.
Like common themes, control over someone or something.
Control.
There's like a allocation of like resources aspect to it too, or ownership of resources, space, property.
So the overarching theme was definitely control. Control, influence. Power was thought of in terms of how does a system or a group of people control resources, influence behavior, influence the outcome of events. But there was one strand of thought that seemed to differ with the class norm. And I used the board at that time to make sense of what we were talking about. I'm not going to use the board today. I don't think we need it. Does anyone remember that definition that stood out?
I think Cash brought up that definition in class about power being something innate in you, like the ability to do something to create social change, right? Isn't that?
To build something?
To build.
Yeah.
Like
Like you build power through like with organized people and like organized money. And we were like unpacking that, and like I think like you had a similar definition, and like we were like debating on like whether like it like had like negative or like positive connotations.
That's right.
And I said something along the lines of like how like it was neutral and stuff, and how like the definition that like you introduced to us was like was kind of like universal because it was like, accessible to everyone. And then Elsa disagreed with me, saying that like I don't know, like I forget what you said, but you just like yeah.
Sorry.
So there was a debate that took place essentially about whether or not, first of all, what power was, the definition that stood out was the notion of thinking of power in terms of the ability to build something. And so the language of building then requires us to kind of sit back and say, okay, why do we define power as a group? And I'm talking about as a group. Why do we define power the way we defined it? Is that perhaps because that's the way we have seen it exercised? Or have we been taught one way or another through images, through modes of representation, through consumerism, that power is about domination, right? So I want to kind of build a little bit on the definition that Huey Newton, co-founder of the Young Lords, provided. And I want to share with us a clip, a brief clip of a Detroit Black Power activist. It'll probably be a little bit less than 10 minutes if we get it right. And so I'm going to go here. And then I want to present us with a question, okay? Present us with a question. So we're going to go here first.
War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The legendary Detroit activist, philosopher Grace Lee Boggs died Monday at the age of 100. She was born in Rhode Island in 1915 to Chinese immigrant parents. She would go on to become deeply involved with the civil rights, black power, labor, environmental justice, feminist movements. Over the past decade, Grace Lee Boggs was a frequent guest on Democracy Now! Her profile grew in 2013 with the release of the Peabody Award-winning documentary, American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs. The film captures Grace's remarkable life story, from collaborating with CLR James to organizing with Malcolm X to starting Detroit Summer.
This is Detroit, Grace in
I feel
Detroit.
so sorry for people who are not living in Detroit. People are always striving for size, to be a giant. And this is a symbol of how giants fall. Keep recognizing that reality is changing and that your ideas have to change. Don't get stuck in old ideas.
Grace has made more contributions to the black struggle than most black people have.
How did you become a philosopher?
I'll just go back 70 years. I'm not sure why I am who I am. I think it does have something to do with the fact that I was born female and born Chinese.
Folks didn't really think about Grace as a Chinese American. She was Grace, you know, she was just one of us.
I think the light bulb goes on very often in conversations that people have, and we don't pay attention to it.
Talk is cheap. I find it very, very difficult to take. I want to tell you honestly, their talk was not cheap.
Oh, God, you should made all kinds of people cry. Myself included. Grace, how would you describe where we stand now?
One of the difficulties when you're coming out of oppression is that you get a concept of the Messiah. You have to get to that point that we are the leaders we've been looking for. We are the children of Martin and Malcolm. I don't know what the next American Revolution is going to be like, but we might be able to imagine it if your imagination were rich enough.
The film American Revolutionary features archival audio and video footage of Grace Lee Boggs dating back to the 1960s.
Back in 1963, Grace was still speaking as an outsider.
I want to make very clear that I do not claim in any sense of the word to be a Negro. I have not lived all my life as a Negro, and I don't think anyone who hasn't really can speak for the Negro.
But once she becomes a Black Power activist, she starts using the word we.
In the Black movement, when we were demanding first-class citizenship, we were saying we were being denied that. We were very ethical, but we wanted more than that. Right. We wanted
This is her husband.
to become part of the people who took responsibility for the country.
So by 1966, 67, she's well known, particularly in Detroit circles, but also nationally, as a Black Power figure.
And I became so active in the Black Power movement that FBI records at that time say that I was probably Afro-Chinese.
Nobody ever really thought, I don't understand this, but folks didn't really think about Grace as a Chinese American. She was Grace, you know, she was just one of us.
Okay, I'll pause it there for a second. Anybody want to comment on that before I pose the question? Anything that Grace said that stood out to you?
I liked your quote, "Don't get stuck in old ideas."
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like a constant reflection, and even when you think that you have solidified your opinions and perceptions of the world, that they should always be willing to change, and you should always maintain humility.
Mm-hmm.
So that just really resonated with me.
Mm-hmm. So the little clip that you saw doesn't actually share this, but Grace Lee Boggs was, she was actually born on the East Coast, and she got her doctorate in philosophy. But what happens is when she goes to look for work, they tell her, you're a woman and you're Chinese, and we're not gonna hire you. And so she decides to go where the workers are. And so perhaps she had a somewhat idealistic notion, somewhat akin to the Young Lords, you know? She's a young woman. She says, well, the workers are in Detroit, I'll go to Detroit. She goes to Detroit, she doesn't know anyone, but she becomes involved in the Black Power movement there, and she marries James or Jimmy Boggs, and she becomes Grace Lee Boggs. It's a powerful story that I want you guys to see for a number of different reasons. And one of the things that I want to suggest is the inclusive nature of her understanding of Black Power, the inclusive nature that she had of Black Power, and the way in which, so there wasn't a threat to her as a Chinese American woman, but also the way in which Puerto Rican movement then engages Black Power as something that is a point of departure for activism. A point of departure for activism. Don't get stuck in old ideas. Don't get stuck in old ideas. Let me, if there's no other comments on that, let me furnish us with the question. Let me see if I can get this to work right. Okay, I had some trouble with the PowerPoint, so it's not going to magically appear. It's already there. The question is already there. And I need a volunteer to read it for us to be able to begin to unpack it. Okay, right here.
Hume famously claimed, quote, "Power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner." But masculinity in the United States has been defined since the era of slavery as a social practice that feminizes women and subjugated men and reduces them to object status. Considering the body of work we have examined this semester, should the idea of power be divorced from our definition of masculinity in order to transform society? Or should we redefine the notion of power articulated within masculinity to bring about social change?
Take a moment to chew on it.
Prophet, can you just clarify, what do you mean by subjugated men?
Men who have been conquered. Men who have been brought to heel. Men who have been vanquished. So I'm thinking about Bell Hooks' article when she talks about plantation patriarchy. But instead of using that language, I wanted to open up the meaning of that language by talking about feminization as an act that reduces the individual to object status, which means denies the individual its full humanity, and marks the individual as necessarily weak and incapable. And we've seen examples of women and men struggling for social justice throughout the semester, and I want us to be able to think about that question of power as it relates to masculinity. Any other questions about the question? Do you all think that you would like to break into groups quickly? Or do you feel like you're ready to sink your teeth into the question?
I think I'm having a hard time just bringing the question back to the ground and see like how it would practically work out. So obviously it's a very theoretical question. I don't know if you have any specific thoughts or maybe examples in how divorcing masculinity or power from masculinity would be carried out, or if that's for us to interpret as well.
That's something for you guys to think about, but I think, did you have something, Sunny, before I say anything?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about the question, but you can go ahead.
I think we could probably start with that first question. If we believe we understand the first passage there, the first paragraph, it is a theoretical question in the sense that it's abstract. But I think we have, if we were to think about Eldridge Cleaver, Assata Shakur, Mickey Meléndez, and some of the characters that are represented in their narratives, that we do have some examples that we can toil with. So let's deal with the first question. Should the idea of power be divorced from the definition of masculinity?
I don't think it should necessarily be divorced or separated. And the main anecdote that I think about is of Mickey Meléndez when he talks about his encounter with sexual abuse when he was younger. I mean, I think all of us here agree that the fact that he went through that and he was able to speak about it later on as a man, as a male, and as a Puerto Rican male, I think we all agree that that gives him more power because he's able to talk about it and not learn from it, but reflect on it and have himself be grown. And I think when you mentioned earlier about something about being hurt but not defeated, or
that's right. I think it was being hurt but not vanquished, something of the sort.
Right. I think that's a great example, or a great way to define what Mickey Meléndez went through, along with Piri Thomas and others. The fact that he was hurt, but that gave him a lot of power, and obviously we don't. The whole definition of masculinity is that you're not supposed to be sexually abused. You're not supposed to be defeated. You're not supposed to be conquered by others, whatever that means. But I think that's obviously not realistic. Sexual abuse has nothing to do with male or being male or female. It's just that people wanting to have power over others, and the fact that if you're a male and you experience that and you can still talk about that, and especially as Mickey Meléndez, who is so powerful, who's been through so much and is a huge activist, I think that makes him even more powerful. The fact that he went through that and he went through all of this and he's still here and he's such a great advocate. And so because of that, I don't think it should necessarily, I think we need to change the idea of what power means. Okay. Not necessarily taking power away, but what does power mean? Does it necessarily mean physical power, like masculine power, or does it also mean maybe emotional and mental tolerance and power?
You're really taking us somewhere with that. Can we go to page 38 and we took the streets? Because what's interesting about what you've done is that instead of taking us to the garbage offensive to Lincoln Hospital, which the group did very well, you've asked us to consider his most vulnerable moment in the text. Take into consideration, this is a text largely devoid of, almost completely devoid of dialogue, where there's stream of consciousness is not one of the narrative techniques used. You've taken us to the most vulnerable moment. So the most vulnerable moment doesn't escape us in spite of the rhetorical devices used. Can you read for us, starting with, it was there I suffered. It would be page 38. It was there I suffered until where he stops, he says power on that same page.
Until power.
Actually, we can go all the way down to where he says trampling the Puerto Rican communities, which towards the end of the page. Okay. At the end of the second paragraph.
It was there I suffered sexual abuse for the second time in my short life. Such an experience has the potential to scar the soul and to prevent any human being from having normal psychological development. Such an experience interrupts the natural development of the emotional self. I became aware of sex at an early and inappropriate age. My life became full of anxiety from the secret I kept inside of me. I became disconnected and detached from the people around me, a trend that would continue well into adulthood. I didn't trust anyone, especially adults. Thankfully, the negative consequences of that trauma had been offset by many years of therapy and the caring love of a safe family environment. But pain and anger are difficult to overcome, and occasionally memories of abuse may have the power to incite feelings of despair. Pain can serve another, more positive function. I found it can be a path to wisdom. Physical, political, or economic race is fundamentally about power. It is an innocent, trusting child betrayed by an adult, or an abusive boss taking advantage of a female worker, or a developed military nation looming over the humbleness of a people. The outright theft of the natural and human resources of one society for the economic, political, and military advancement of an empire. All of these are cases in which power is exercised to oppress. I'm sure the rage and anger I suffered in early childhood was channeled into my resistance to the oppressive forces bent on trampling the Puerto Rican community.
Let's unpack that. Thank you for reading that. Let's unpack that.
It's interesting because I take the middle paragraph. There are 3 emotions kind of highlighted there. There are pain and anger that are put together, and those seem, to me at least, to be kind of traditionally associated with men. You know, men don't show pain, but they go through pain, and men can be characterized by anger. You know, just like very broadly, very kind of stereotypically speaking. And then they say, but all this pain and anger can lead to despair, and despair is not a masculine trait. A man is a weak man if he falls into despair. So it's just very interesting how honesty can be in this. Actually, I lost where I was going. Never mind. Sorry about that.
Does anyone want to piggyback on that? The way in which Elsa's reading the emotions that Mickey has named. We've got pain, anger, pain and anger. So pain is the type of thing that's not associated with the acknowledgement of pain. It's not associated with masculinity.
I think it's kind of what we were talking about before, in like the way this narrative is written, in that like it does get like really vulnerable at some moments, but I feel like compared to the other narratives we read in this class, it quickly turns it around and shows like, well, this is, you know, what I got from it, and this is what I'm gonna do because of that. And you know how you brought up the emotions that were came out, like before that talks about my life being full of anxiety. Like that's just a powerful statement, I think, to make, and then to quickly just 2 paragraphs later talk about you know, how rape's about power, and you know how that got him to like what he decided to do. I thought is pretty interesting, and how you pointed out there's no like quotes in the book really. I think that changes it a little bit, because instead of us being like, oh, I feel like he thinks, or I think he's going through pain in this, you know, quote, it's just he says, but pain and anger are difficult to overcome. So we just kind of have to imagine what kind of pain it was and not really like read it.
For me, I thought it was interesting, these 2 sentences that are next to each other where it goes, pain can serve another, more positive function. I found it can be a path to wisdom. And then after it says, physical, political, or economic rape is fundamentally about power. I thought it's interesting how they talk about pain being a path to wisdom and then bring in rape again, and how we talked about how it destroys someone. And from that pain, that type of pain, I find it really hard to see how someone can find wisdom from that action. Like, I don't understand how it can be a path to wisdom after suffering something like that.
I think it's kind of coming back to the definition. Power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner. And although he didn't have control over him experiencing sexual abuse, he has somewhat control over where he directs his feelings. So like they're exerting power over him, and then he has ability to decide what he does after that. So like he could have gone into the kind of cycle of abusing somebody else,
Yeah.
but instead he's turning into it using, he's turning it into being aware of his surroundings and other people, and just gaining a little more perspective, so like kind of turning it into wisdom instead of going down a negative path. That's kind of how I read it.
We go Liza and then Elsa.
Yeah, I think on top of that too, like it is so terrible that you sort of have to confront it later in your life, and when you do, not only do you learn things about like your surroundings, but you learn certain like, I guess you could say wisdoms within yourself that you didn't realize that you had, because you have to confront those sort of like demons that are inside of you because of what that like action did to you. So the way like I read it was not so much wisdom about like the outside world, but more like within, and just sort of like what someone can come back from, or sort of like what lies within them.
Tommy, I think I disagree with you. I think masculinity is still like is very much ingrained in his reaction. I think because he cites the fact that he cheated on his wife later on.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
He kind of like attributes his cheating to his sexual abuse.
Yeah, I forgot about that. But I guess that's what he's doing with kind of the reaction of this.
Yeah. It's just interesting how like I read that as kind of like him trying to reclaim his masculinity, trying to like reassert himself, and then like through the process of the first marriages, he kind of is able to come to terms with that, and then he's able to be faithful to his final wife, which is great. But it like takes him a really long time. He first attempts to kind of like reclaim his masculinity by cheating on his wife and kind of just being this like hyper macho kind of figure.
No, I got you.
I also think you could sort of connect this passage back to like the topic of social deservedness in the sense of like acceptance in society, because I think we're also saying about his masculinity, saying all these are cases in which power is exercised to oppress. So I feel like in that sense, it's sort of fitting into this maybe time masculine. Like there's two ways to define power in terms of masculine power of oppression, but then human Newton's formation of power to make it act in a desired manner. So I feel like there's sort of two folds to how you can approach power, and it sort of has to do with social deservedness and like acceptance.
Do you think that he's trying to access social deservedness by cheating?
Not necessarily. I feel like that's sort of he's maybe adhering to some sort of norm in that sense, but also just that it's about because his the sexual violence that he suffered as a child is sort of being portrayed onto cheating. He's sort of like being channeled by cheating on his wife.
So he's sharing something very personal with us here. He's being exceptionally vulnerable. Like I said before, he spares us the details, probably for himself as well as for the reader, and probably also because of the purpose. Which I think actually the purpose of the text is something that actually reveals itself rather easily, because he's constantly, as Natalia said, he's constantly telling us, this is what I did with that pain, or this is what I learned from that experience. But one thing that he says here that I want to take us back to is we consider whether or not we need to redefine power as it relates to masculinity in order for social change to be possible. And it says here that, he says pain's a path to wisdom, but he talks about it being the interruption of a natural process. So such an experience interrupts the natural development of the emotional self. And when I spoke to Mickey last summer, he said, colonialism this is powerful, I thought. So I want to say it carefully, but he said colonialism is akin to rape in the sense that it's the interruption of a natural process that's taking place within whatever country. So Puerto Rico, if you remember, in 1898 had gained a certain autonomy from Spain. Spain at that point had lost Cuba, or was about to lose Cuba. The Cubans had been fighting for 30 years for their independence. The Philippines put up quite a resistance, I know, to the U.S. presence. I don't know much about the relationship to the Filipinos and the Spanish, so that's something you could research yourself. But Puerto Rico was already in the process of gaining a greater autonomy. So El Grito de Lares was already beginning to produce some results. enter the United States. They don't speak the language. They don't know the difference between the matronym and the patronym. They impose a military rule. And so I think part of what he's revealing to us here is that revolution is something that has to begin within. It's something that he actually says in the interviews, if you listen to the interviews that I did with him, but it has to begin within. So before you pick up the torch and go outside and march, it's something that has to happen here and here. And his emotional self was so wounded that he was reproducing some of the dominant structures or dominant behaviors that he had been taught. Abused persons often abuse, but they don't have to abuse.
I'm wondering what everybody else thinks about the part where he says, I became aware of sex at an early age and all the way until caring love of a safe family environment. I think if I read that without knowing who the author was, as far as gender goes, I would have automatically assumed this was a female. Just because, going back to what Natalie was saying about, the choice of words and how he talks about anxiety, I also think the choice of words he uses, such as caring love of a safe family environment, emotional self, disconnected, detached. I don't know, I don't know what you guys think, but it just, to me, it just based on anything growing up in a society where women are more likely, or feminine people are more likely to talk about their emotions and use these kinds of words, whereas masculine people are not supposed to use these kinds of words, or it's not very common. I think I would have assumed that this was a female, and the fact that it is, this is coming from a male Puerto Rican point of view and that he's using these words, I think it's also a really powerful way of, like you said, showing other maybe oppressed male who've been through similar things, showing them that revolution does begin inside of you first, and that, I don't know, I thought it was a really great model of what masculinity really means, basically. If that makes sense.
Anyone want to dialogue with that?
I'm gonna try. No, it's interesting that you're talking about the words used, because for me, another part with the words that was interesting was when Cleaver was talking about the mind and the body of society, when he referred to the differences between the white male and the black male, how the white male was the mind of society now, and with education, everything was pursuing that. So he said that men were becoming more effeminate through the use of language, and as you were saying, these particular words, and he saw it as losing touch with masculinity if you're not pursuing the physical, normal masculine stereotypes.
You're talking about the difference between the omnipotent administrator and the super masculine menial. Or we can say the administrator and the menial. Menial meaning that you've been designated physical task that anyone could do. You can do them because you're physically stronger than others. How did I like this? How then do we bring Cleaver into dialogue with Mickey, who's still with us? Cleaver's passed on. Well, perhaps I want to be accurate and I want to be fair, in the honest sense of that word. Does Cleaver's theorizing of the historical relationship between men of European descent and men of African descent in the United States hold true in your critical opinion? Considering all your years of schooling, all the films you've watched, the readings you've done this semester, do you think his analysis, did he get the correct analysis, or was his analysis wrong? Can we start with that? Okay. Say that again?
It's wrong.
Okay.
I don't quite know if that's what you're talking about, but there's non-black males who are extremely talented in physical activities and sports, and it's true also for blacks, and there are also black males who are extremely intelligent and are mentally just really powerful. It's an interesting analysis, and I don't know if it's coming from the fact that I think we talked about this a while back, that a lot of African cultures do come from oral cultures, and they really appreciate and value, like dance and physical movement. And so I don't know, I'm thinking like over the years, maybe that's why they developed such like great strength. And then like whereas white, European descent, we've been privileged to have resources of academia, like reading, math, writing. Like they were able to get that trade from like India and all over the world, and so they were able to build this mental stability and intelligence because of all those resources available, whereas in African cultures those weren't as available. So I don't know if that's where his theories come from.
He's actually starting with the plantation.
Okay.
My own read of what he says here is that he was probably in the process of learning about the African continent.
Oh, I see.
He was probably in the process, so he probably didn't know a lot. So if we think about what Assata Shakur says about education, and I'm going to use the language of Carter G. Woodson, miseducation. So he himself had probably been the victim of miseducation, as had Piri Thomas and Assata Shakur. Mickey talks about really beginning to learn about his heritage once he got to college, and that was also an active thing, an active decision on his part. So African societies would have had the metallurgy, the architecture, the mathematics, and all those types of things prior to, and different forms of writing, prior to contact with Europeans. It's the plantation that Eldridge Cleaver is putting in El Primer Plano. It's what he's putting in the middle there and says, woof, that's when we became the menial. That's when we were transformed to something else, and we're still living with that. That's my reading of Cleaver. Mm-hmm. But we have a couple of hands here. I don't want to silence any voices. Elsa, and then I know Nick wanted to speak again.
I don't think that definition holds true. I agree with Sunny. I think it's like a very Eurocentric definition. I think it's a product of miseducation, like you said. I think that it fits within a certain historical context, social historical context, but I don't agree with it.
Well, I don't think Cleaver is vying for that. He's just naming it. He's saying that black individuals of African descent who were put into slavery have been denied the right to be the mind.
Yeah, that's true, but he's also just silencing the women in this point too. It's just, he's not saying black individuals, he's saying black men. Black men, white men.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
yeah,
I mean,
no,
he
I
might
get what
use
you're
that.
saying, yeah.
He might be using men as humanity.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Do we know that if he is using the term men as referring to just
No, he's not using men or man to refer only to humanity, because remember he talks about the Euro-American woman of upper class status as ultra feminine, and then he talks about black women as the Amazon. What's so difficult is that we know that categorizing is something that we talked about early on, right, Lakawa? The fact that categorizing is something that people do across the board for different reasons, but his category seems so rigid that you almost want to push back. I don't want to say too much more except to say that he is trying to theorize what had happened. He's trying to understand the struggles of black men, and he wants to provide a historical context for it. And I think that if you really want to know whether or not there's much to his notion, you'd have to read Frederick Douglass. I'd say read William Wells Brown, read Martin Delany, who wrote novels, who was a free black man. You'd have to do a bit more research. Look at Mary Prince, look at Juan Francisco Manzano in the Cuban context. Did you want to add to that?
No, I totally forgot.
Okay.
To kind of return to the question, I think the idea of power should be not divorced from masculinity, because that kind of brings one group down, but maybe extended, not necessarily divorced from masculinity, but extended to beyond just masculinity. So femininity should not be viewed as femininity should not be constructed as necessarily opposite to masculinity, and the fact that it's a disempowered kind of category of being. So I honestly think the binary kind of sets up this opposite thing. So ideally, personally, I advocate for no binary, but I think the idea of power, I think as long as there are these rigid categories that are necessarily set up as opposing forces, when one is considered to be superior to the other is automatically going to be inferior. So I think the idea of power it wouldn't really necessarily do good to just switch the idea of power to femininity. But I think if the idea of power kind of got spread across, like distributed equally, which is not likely to happen. But that's, I think.
Well, what worlds can we build? What worlds can we create?
Yeah.
You know. What's interesting about it, I'm curious if you guys think there are examples when we talk about femininity. Are there examples of where femininity is not disempowered, but empowered, with daring, or powerful in a way that's akin to what Cash and Sunny were talking about? Powerful because it builds, or powerful because through vulnerability, wisdom is built in the text that we've seen.
I think these are different types of power that we're talking about. I definitely agree that femininity can be its own power, but in kind of the conventional sense, when femininity is powerful, it's because women are standing up and kind of embodying the male kind of archetype of power. So I agree that femininity can be powerful, and I believe it's, especially today, it's starting to become a new idea of power, but it's also, I think it's still rooted in kind of the masculine prototype.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in this day and age, it's almost impossible to divorce power from typical notions of masculinity, but instead it should be like, the power should be redirected to lift the voices and empower individuals who are typically disempowered.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what was it, Audre Lorde, who was talking about how at the forefront of the civil rights movement also has to be the issues of women.
Mm-hmm.
They can't be...
Sexism and blackface, you're thinking.
Yeah, they can't be mutually exclusive, they have to be together. So men have to use their power for the positive, for change.
But I also want us to think about Asada's grandmother. I want us to think about when Asada's grandmother won't lower the chain. They own property, I believe it's North Carolina. They own, Wilmington. They own property as the segregated South. They have a beach though, so people can come to that beach. People can, African Americans have their own getaway. Think about that in relation to Mickey Meléndez's text when he said, oh yeah, the Negroes, so-called Negroes, could only on one day go out, just Thursdays, you know? Who cares? If you have a beach like that, you can go to the beach. Wasn't there some power? And maybe I should say, didn't Assata Shakur's grandmother exercise a certain autonomy through property ownership? And then when she very firmly says she's not going to lower the chain, she didn't shoot the man. She didn't scream Black Power. She just said, I'm not going to lower the chain.
I can't, ever since you mentioned the whole idea about the revolution inside of you, I can't stop thinking about it. I think that is what real power is. When you have that revolution inside you, the power comes from like inside yourself, and that sounds so cheesy. And your mind. But I mean, I think that's what also Asada's grandmother is doing, is that she is affirming her own identity, who she is, and she has a firm belief of how she fits into the context of society, and she's not letting anyone else hinder her, and that's why she's, so holding on to her property, and like, the way she even like talks to Asada about, never failing to believe in yourself. I mean, I think that is like real power. I mean, that's not how a society necessarily projects power to be, but when you're not hindered by those who are imposing physical power on you, I think that's when you have the real power, essentially. same with Mickey Meléndez, and the same with Brew. Even after they were physically defeated, they still had that emotional and mental power. Which I think in the long run, that is the real power. Because I mean, you're at peace with yourself then, because then, you know, on the outside you may be defeated, but like you're gonna be living in your own body for the rest of your life. So you need to be at peace with your own mind. That is the biggest power you can have. You know. Like,
how can you lead anyone else or encourage anyone else if you're not at peace?
Right.
So I want to think about the feminine power, and going back to grandma for a second, and forgive me if I'm talking about grandma a lot today, as we get ready to wrap up. But she's doing this in the home space. She's not marching. She's not brandishing a weapon. I'm sure they had weapons, but she's not brandishing a weapon. You know, she's doing this in the home space. She said, "Don't you let." I forget how she put it. I was looking for it where she said, "Don't let anybody." Who's the best or something like? Who's better than you? That's what it is. Who's better than you? Nobody. Who's better than you? Nobody. You know? Think about how powerful that is. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything further, or if we have exhausted our resources and are simply in need of lunch. That could also be the case. Anything else? Anybody want to say anything else? Well, I hope you will. Are you going to have la última palabra, la cava?
I'm not anything.
Okay. All right, well, I want to thank you all for engaging in difficult but necessary conversations. You should give yourselves some applause. And for those who are graduating, buena suerte, stay in touch, and se acabó semestre. I just want to say with regard to the final assignment, that I know you weren't able to be here yesterday, what I'm asking people to do is to write a 1.5 to 2 page reflection about a passage that was meaningful to them. So if you were to go to Sada Shakur's narrative where she's talking about her grandmother, you could take a passage out of that and speak about how it was meaningful to you. Please do so in a way that reflects that you have knowledge of the other readings. So please reference the other readings, and please be accurate in terms of what page number something is on. But think about how it affected you personally. So that I'm going to do a personal reflection, since no one felt they had enough time to go into the studio and do the video. And the other thing I want to ask is, it should be single space, okay? Single space, 1.5 to 2 pages, and give me an image. Give me an image. Give me an image of Asada. Give me an image of Mickey Meléndez. Give me an image of Papo. You know, it could be about any of the text, but preferably the literary text. Thank you so much for a great semester.
Thank you. Does the main passage have to be one of the books, or could it be like collection lessons de Palante?
Yeah, it can be from Palante. It can be from the writings of the young lord's writings from Palante. Yeah.
Thank you, Profe. I'll see you next semester. I've got you first.
Oh.